Seth, man, so excited to be chatting with you. As I mentioned in the open, you're a gentleman that I've known for years, mutual friends. I think probably Ryan Engelbert was the first one that kind of, crossed our paths. And this has been a long time coming. And what's so great about that is it's not a long time coming. It's like, oh, I'm throwing you a bone. It's like you have done the work to make yourself this enigmatic figure in leadership, and as you're speaking, as you're going and talking to people, and really enigmatic because you're kind of shining a light onto much of what I speak about here in the Impact Driven Leader podcast, and in this generational change, but also what does real leadership actually look like? So I'm going to stay there, and you take it however you want because I know it's going to be fun after this.
Yeah, well, I guess first and foremost, thanks for having me. I'm so glad we're getting a chance to actually sit down and finally do this. You mentioned Ryan Engelbert, and I get a big smile on my face just for a context standpoint. Ryan and I played college football together, and as shocking as it is to me to think that was almost exactly 20 years ago, which is like, how did I play college ball 20 years ago? We were together at a state school in Wisconsin from 2000 to 2004. And of course, Engelbert has gone on to build incredible things and is still a dear friend. So I'm glad that he brought us together, and we both come a long ways since we were playing ball together. 20 years, wild.
Okay, so let's start there. You're as well a farm kid from the Midwest. I'm from Ohio. We don't need to get into any Ohio, Minnesota, rivalry. There isn't.
Well, there isn't much to speak of. Minnesota hasn't won any games against you in a long time, so there really isn't a rivalry.
Yeah, exactly. Unless we want to talk about hockey, but there's only a few people in the world that care about hockey. It's great. That's awesome. Hockey's fun in-person sport. But let's start from your beginning and how that's informed what you're doing today.
Sure. So I'll give the Cliff Note version. If we take it all the way back, you mentioned it. I grew up on a farm in Minnesota. It's actually a fourth generation farm. So father, grandfather, great grandfather, alive all at the same time. And really from a formative influence standpoint, what that gave me insight on was very early on, I started to recognize and see this idea that each generation really has their own unique personality, profile, beliefs, views of the world, ways in which they approach business and leadership. And I sort of was in a working laboratory of it. My great grandfather, a product of, and lived through the Great Depression and scarcity and saving, and you never know when terrible things are going to happen. My grandfather, World War II generation, saw tremendous sacrifice, saw the country come together to accomplish great feats, deeply patriotic, deeply loyal. And my father, a baby boomer, and boomers just sort of like revolution children, and saw the world through a very different lens, and they thought about money differently. And so, but they were all really potent and powerful leaders in their own right. My dad was active in the church in our local community, and so I saw him in front of groups of people, leading people from a very early age. And so it just sort of always instilled in me this idea that each generation has their own unique story, their own unique lens, so I understood those differences. It also helped me bridge generational gaps with people as I got older. I could make connections with older executives and entrepreneurs, et cetera. We were talking about football earlier on.
Yeah.
I go to university, I go to study business, play football, unbelievable, great experience. I leave that, and when I come out of school, I go to work for a management consulting firm that specialized in executive alignment, culture change work, and process improvement work, essentially working with leaders to either work on their people or their process. And at the time, I'm just about 25 years old, and we're primarily working with the C-suite. And as you can imagine, at that age, and I'm an account executive and I'm developing relationships, these executives are looking at me like, what in the world are you going to tell me about leadership and culture change and leading transformation? You're like the same age as my kid, and he's a knucklehead. And so I felt all of that. And so to bridge the gap, I started asking them more specific questions about their younger workforce. And at the time, this is 2005, 6, 7, that sort of block. And the conversation around millennials, Gen Y, sort of this new generation, our generation, we're just starting to flood the workplace. And there wasn't a lot being written about it yet. There weren't, like we see today, a million articles. And so I started asking them more specific questions about our collective generation's impact on their culture, their ability to attract, retain, et cetera. And Tyler, all of this pain, and frustration and angst came pouring out of every single client. No surprise, which there usually is when it comes to a new generation. And so as an entrepreneur, sort of at my heart, my core, when there's a pain in the marketplace, there's an opportunity if you can bring a solution to that pain. And for the first time, my age in these environments was no longer a liability, it was a benefit, because I was one of them. I could give them perspective. Yeah. So I started studying the topic and the theme of generational shifts. Two interesting things happened. The first is one of the first books that I pick up is this is 2006, by a gentleman by the name of Peter Sheehan. He's an Australian lad, basically my age, and I look him up online. He's written a bestseller. He's traveling all over the world. He's speaking on massive stages. For the first time, I make this connection of at our age, you could really have influence. This is pre sort of our new era of social media influence,
sure,
where we see young people having influence all the time now. But back then, you didn't. And interestingly enough, about Peter, today, almost 15, almost 20 years later, Peter Sheehan is one of my business partners in another venture. We ended up becoming dear friends and business partners. The second book I picked up was by a duo named David Stillman and Lynn Lancaster. And they wrote a book called When Generations Collide. Came out in the early 2000s. And it just so happened that David was based in Minneapolis, where I was living at the time. Found someone who knew someone who knew someone that could make the connection. We meet for coffee, and I kind of pitch him on my vision for where I think the conversation is going to go, the message that was on my heart. I really wanted to speak. They had a really vibrant speaking practice, and they were working on their next book. Long story short, it took, 12, 18 months of building the relationship, being in constant contact and connection, before we finally found an opportunity to be able to work together. And in 2009, I joined forces with he and Lynn. I came onto their platform. It was called Bridgeworks. Got to help them finish their second book called The M Factor, which was all about millennials. And it gave me my entry point into the world of professional speaking. They introduced me to clients and speaking bureaus, the sort of distribution channel to get on big platforms. And it really was my launch. I owe, honestly, my start in being able to get into this business to both of them. We worked together for a couple of years. In 2013, they sell the practice, and it was the perfect opportunity for me to launch on my own. And so April of 2013, I pivoted my core research and thesis from thinking exclusively about generational shifts to thinking about larger future of work, future of leadership trends. Partially because the new individual that bought the firm, I had a non-compete. I couldn't speak about generations for the next 12 months. And my heart really felt compelled to talk about larger themes. But the connection point for me was, in studying youth, when we look at youth trends, what we're really getting are clues about the future. So even though I've been technically studying generations, what I said is what I've really been doing is I've been looking at what's going to unfold in the future. It gave me clues about where we go next. So I pivoted the brand and our research to look more specifically into the future of work. And Tyler, it's been, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary last spring, which has been pretty incredible. And today the business is sort of split up between speaking, advising, a little bit of coaching work. We typically do 60 to 70 live events a year, and we're having a lot of fun. And that means I get to see, I think about, your listeners who are tuning in right now that are either operating inside of maybe a large Fortune 100 or they're a small to mid-sized operator. We really serve both. About 60% of my clients are Fortune 100. So they're executives who are, they've got a lot of resources at their disposal, but you're also navigating sometimes large and bureaucratic entities and, trying to make your way through that. And other times you're under a little bit more scrappy environment with less resources, but you've got more discretion and autonomy to be able to go create and make change. But I love to be in the trenches like I know you do, and rolling up our sleeves and spending time with leaders and talking leadership, which I know is one of our big intentions for our time together.
So you left me with two seats. One of them I kind of thought to get at. And I'm going to hit it first. The second one I'm going to mention so we can come back to it. As you mentioned about the future of work, and this is the thing that I see very interesting. You know, we have a generation that's fixated on millennials. Oh, millennials this, millennial. And we're still kind of holding on to that. But yet quickly realize, hey, there's a whole new generation. And we just went through something that even informed them in a greater way of what the future of their work is going to be like. So don't be quick to get back to what it was, because this new generation is saying, no, we'll never go back there. So I'll plant that, let that thought simmer in your brain. I'll come back to it. But I want to talk about something that you mentioned. And it is, to me, the future of business training. And it's so funny because it's going back to a practice that has been around for thousands of years. You are a product of it. And it didn't come from necessarily what you learned in a university. You just described everything that is built in you, in your career and your opportunity, is through an apprenticeship. And to me, that's what's amazing, is we're coming into that world where we're facing this. I have a daughter who's a junior in high school. And she's coming quickly. It's like, do I go to college? Do I not go to college? Have a freshman in high school. He's thinking about, well, is this real that I don't have to go to college and can have whatever career I want? And yet you described a fashion in which you learned your trade. You got your opportunities because of an apprenticeship. So I want to just allow that to simmer and go wherever it goes, because I think there's a lot of different pathways here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really beautiful that you use that word. Oftentimes I will actually call the start of my relationship with David and Lynn an apprenticeship. And I often call it that partially because in the very beginning, when I came on, we were just coming, through the economic meltdown and Great Recession of the fall of 2008. And so the speaking business, their business, got totally upended. I mean, literally, I don't even want to give you exact numbers of like how much revenue got reduced, but the bottom line was, they're sort of looking at me saying, we would love to bring you on, we would love to work with you, but we just don't have the budget. And I don't come from a lot. I was very blessed from a family standpoint to like have my family, have my roots. But farming, when I grew up, farming in the 80s was rough business, and like
Yes, it
interest
was.
rates tough, right? Like
Yeah.
and so all that means is like I couldn't pick up the phone and call the bank of mom and dad. Like I was on my own, and so figuring out what was I willing to sacrifice for this opportunity, like how big was the calling on my heart to try to do this work. And so, I tell a story a lot of times of like I donated blood platelets twice a week. Twice a week, 4 times a month, ended up being about $250 total dollars, but it was like, that was a car payment and gas, scrapping together odds and end jobs to like buy groceries, to just like get into the business. And when I tell that story to people, I'm often telling it under the guise of like, your dreams are going to cost something. To go for the message or the work that's on your heart is going to require a deposit of something. You're going to have to give something up. You may have to give up, fill in the blank. But for me, it really, it required a pretty large sacrifice. And fortunately, the business, it took 12 to 18 months for it to kind of come back around the other side, and has, been a very incredible and lucrative endeavor. But to your point, in the beginning, it was an apprenticeship. And I think it's a beautiful way to learn a trade, learn a skill, learn an industry, be of value to someone else. The question is how do you make that work from a financial standpoint? And, I don't envy, your kids and this generation that are coming of age right now with inflation and the cost of living in homes and rent. It's more difficult now than it was even for me, but the opportunities do exist. I think the thing that people have at their disposal is, and Tyler, you know this, we're of similar age, the tools they have at their disposal to to be scrappy, to develop a side hustle, to enter into the gig economy. Like there's lots of ways to support yourself while you go after your dream today.
Oh, that is so true. I mean, that's a product of where we're at in regard to network marketing, and allowed us, my wife and I, to get to this point. And it's also still a great training ground. I mean, it was for us. We had a gym that was named Training Ground, and part of what we learned through that experience is education costs. You can either go to business school or you can run a business and learn it there. So it's kind of like, hey, honestly, you're not going to save much one way or the other. It's just one gives you the potential for, a much bigger return, and, you decide which one that is. But I think where I'm, again, going into is if we model this style of leadership into an apprenticeship, so often it is, yes, there's earning your, dues. It's paying your dues and it's earning your place. But yet it's like, man, we have to be way more willing as leaders to empower. Because if we're not giving people the willingness and ability to fail forward and guide them through that, then we're not teaching them. We're just saying, go sit in the corner, go be an analyst, and till you get frustrated with it, and then you'll move on, and I'll find someone else that wants to just be sit in the corner. It's like, that's not where people are going, because the great difference that you mentioned for the generation going forward and working compared to us is they have way more options.
Yeah.
So many more options that it's kind of like, you better empower them. I heard this stat from you. I've quoted it differently. I think it's relative that, there's 10,000 people turning 65 every day. There's far less 18-year-olds. Couple that with, and this is where I put my own spin on it. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but for every job, there's 0.9 or some number less new applicants available today. That even lends into this apprenticeship. It's like, hey, bring people in and teach them rather than say, go learn and come to me. Okay, that's a lot. I'll let you to pick that apart.
Yeah, well, I mean, the numbers around, and they've been shifting as we've come out of COVID. There's a period of time where there were 2 job openings for every 1 job hunter. And when you just sort of let that settle, and we've come down from that a bit, but there's still, there's more open positions than there are available talent. And so that puts so much more pressure on us as leaders to create cultures and environments and highly attractive opportunities to be able to get great talent, because people have choice today. That's one. 2, you talked about the importance and the challenge as leaders face in empowering our people to give opportunities. And one of the things that I talk about to sort of give some context or perspective to leaders is just sort of honor and acknowledge the environment that many of us have come of age in. Technically speaking, we're still kind of young, Tyler. 20 years into the business, we've got folks that, we've got our Gen Xers and even some baby boomers that are still around. Many of them came of age, and I feel like I was right on the edge of this, especially operating inside of large corporations, where you were rewarded for your individual performance and contribution. So as you moved up in the organization, it was based on your individual intelligence, your skills, your competencies, your ability to deliver. And you ascend into this role of leadership. And when you get into this position, you now believe, you're sort of taught, sometimes very subtly, that your responsibility is to predict and control the environment. Meaning what? Meaning predict all of the change and transformation that might occur, predict how customers might respond. You need to have all the foresight, and then you need to control the organization or the team's response to it. You dictate to them what we need to do. But you had the pressure of you need to be able to see around the corner. Why? Because leaders have the answer. Why? Because they've got access to more information. They know, which means now you need to know. Here's the challenge. If we were to ask your listeners right now to raise their hands, if we were to ask them this question, how many of you have people on your teams or in your organization with knowledge and skills that you don't have? I guarantee you 100% of them should be raising their hands. Should be. And what that means is that basing your team's, your division, or your organization's success on your individual intelligence and your ability to predict and control the environment is not only a bad idea, it's a liability. And so we have to shift from thinking about it Success is predicated on our individual intelligence, and shifting to it's based on our collective intelligence. From individual intelligence to collective intelligence. The collective intelligence of the team, of the organization, of the institution. And your job as a leader now is not to predict and control, but it is to sense and respond. And when we say sense and respond, what do we mean by that? Sensing and responding is like taking input from the people closest to the problems or closest to our customers to get their insight, to get their feedback, because they're there seeing what's actually happening. Yep. They're oftentimes more knowledgeable than we are as in our vaulted positions of leadership. We need to take that information in, and then we need to empower them, your words, to respond, to perform, to deliver, to make the day, to solve the problem. We've got to push empowerment out to those closest. So I'm sensing, and sensing can happen via technology. Sometimes we've got automation tools that are giving us feedback about maybe it's customer satisfaction, performance, productivity, shop floors. But sometimes it's simply being in a meeting, virtual or in person, and being able to ask your people for input and feedback and ideas, and having created enough psychological safety in that environment where people are willing to tell you what's really going on. And so a question I would ask our leaders that are tuned in right now is like, do you really know what's going on? Are people willing to tell you the truth? Do you have enough self-awareness? If they weren't, to recognize, I think people are holding back sometimes. And how do you know? Like, what would be a clue? One of the things I look for if we go on site with a client, and I'll sit in on some meetings or sit in on a few Zoom sessions, virtual meetings. And if you ask for feedback, you ask for ideas, you throw the question out, and it gets met with silence, right? The epidemic of silence. How many of us have been in meetings like that? No, it's like there's ideas, there's feedback that's on the tip of people's tongue, and they're unwilling to put it forward. Why? Almost 9 times out of 10, it comes down to fear. Fear, right? It's fear. It's a lack of psychological safety.
I think body language displays that as well. You can sit there, and I've been in those situations, and it's the body language of the eyes looking around and darting, or all of a sudden it just gets very cold, and there's not this connectedness occurring. It's like they don't feel safe. They have a lot to tell you, and they don't tell you. And this is a situation. Now we're digging into the weeds where we're getting to have fun. Is I've been in situations where the appointed leader. Right? The appointed leader, I'd say, because they're the title, whatever, and we discern that for what it is. But the appointed leader asked that question. And then maybe there's a junior leader or an additional leader or some other person that starts to facilitate. And then all of a sudden, everyone opens up. Totally. And I've seen that situation, and it's like, oh, that's who they trust. That's who's actually connected with them. And I've been in those situations where that creates a power struggle between those two, but yet they're both on the same team. And it's like, if you don't have that trust, people aren't opening up with you, and they open up to another leader. Instead of like, I need to force them out because they're an issue, you go to them and say, what am I missing? What am I not getting right? Because they trust you and they don't trust me. But that takes, as you mentioned, so much self-awareness.
Self-awareness, humility, right? The humility to be able to ask for help or get feedback. When you're in those situations, and again, we may have some folks right now that are tuned in and they're like, I've got that going on. Tyler, sometimes I'll have leaders come up to me after sessions and they'll say, Seth, I have that going on, in and amongst my team, this kind of epidemic of silence. But they're like, but I have never personally done anything to make people feel afraid. I've never publicly humiliated someone. And they genuinely mean it. And sometimes that's true. And this is what I tell them, is that oftentimes people will bring with them onto our teams, just like we bring childhood trauma into our adult relationships. We bring past trauma from bad cultures and bad leaders with us onto the next team. And so you might not have directly done something to make people fearful. However, You have a responsibility then in that position to help rebuild the trust. And so what should you do? And you started to rattle some of the things off, but it's like, be willing to, I always say as a leader, be willing to not be the first one to present the ideas. Encourage the ideas to come up. When someone shares, encourage, reward. When people exhibit the values of the culture that we want to create, we spotlight it, we highlight it, we keep pulling it out of them. You got to be consistent in how you show up. Be willing to be vulnerable. Be willing to say that you don't know. Make the environment safe so people feel like, man, if Tyler and Seth can say that they're unsure or share bad ideas or off the wall and like are willing to kind of put themselves out there, I want to too. You got to go first.
Yep.
It's go first leadership.
Well, I think one of the practices that I've embraced in leadership roles, and to me, this is in business, coaching, and interacting, to coaching my son's middle school football team. And you're going to love this, and just because this is going to go back to that very first thing I mentioned, this changing of generation, and what has been the great revelation to me over the last several months. And one thing that I practiced. So I've never coached middle school football before. I've never coached football before. I've coached other sports for many years. I only played a little bit of football. I was small. I would have loved it. My body and genetics didn't have it for me at that point. And one of the things that I did, and you'll, again, for the listeners, you've been here before, you've heard me talk about sports, or you listened to the podcast a couple weeks ago where I shared this, is there was a mistake I made in our very first game. It's 4th and 11. We're at the 25. We had the ball. We were trying to just kill the clock. There was 3 or 4 minutes left in the final quarter, and we go for it on 4th and 11, and we didn't get it. And after the game, we ended up winning. We're able to, shut them down on defense. And I realized, I screwed up there because I had timeouts in my pocket and I didn't take the timeout. Now, that not only came to me, but what I did then is I went to the team and said, hey, I'm sorry, I messed up. We had a timeout. I did not put you in the best spot. I'd admitted it. I took that accountability. And one thing that I saw throughout the season is, again, me asking for it and encouraging and building that connection and safety you talked about, is players being willing to be accountable. And this is what I've learned in leadership, is you can't expect people on your team to be accountable if you don't model it. I screwed up. I made a mistake. I'm sorry I did the wrong thing for us as an organization. It's going to cost us. I have to take ownership for that. And when you do that, man, that's another layer of building in safety, because now people feel like, oh, if he's going to take ownership, well, why can't I?
1,000% accountability coupled with ownership. And if you can foster that, if you can model that, you create an opportunity for that to exist in the culture. But we can't assume, to your point, or expect our people to do it if we're not willing to do it.
So that brings me back to, as we see this next generation evolving into the workforce, right? We have this post-COVID generation that, were 18 in 2020, now that have evolved into being workers, or they were, just turning 18. Now they're in college or graduating college. What is your perspective as you're talking to organizations, sharing about them? But then let's circle back around and just kind of like, what I believe is we've trained them to be how they are. And so we as leaders, coaches, youth sports coaches, parents, involved in the community need to take ownership and not look at them like, oh, this is wrong. Say, oh, how do we go back to the beginning and fix it?
Yeah. So what I can tell you is, since we've transitioned into, looking more exclusively at future of work trends, I'm not as close to the generation's research and theory as we were in the past. But what we are seeing, there are a couple of things of note. What we're talking about here are the children of Generation Xers. And so there's a difference even in the parent-child relationship and dynamic. If you sort of reflect back and you think about how it's been shifting, if you look at baby boomers and their traditionalist parents, so the cutoff there is roughly 1946. Pre-46 traditionalists, post-46 boomers. Between those two generations, between parent and child, there was a cultural revolution that took place. right? That was the 1960s. It was a pushback against any authority figure, including parents. And that showed up in music and in pop culture. It was like mom and dad are square. If you look at the parent-child relationship between baby boomers and millennials, right? So boomers born between 46 and 64, millennials born between roughly 1980 and 1995. There was a technological revolution between these two generations. For you and I, especially as early leading edge millennials, we were in early internet chat rooms when it was dial-up internet, and our parents were like, "Who are you talking to? And what is you're in the bedroom talking to like some stranger across the world. You don't even know who they are with a different screen name." There was a technological revolution between Gen X, born between 65 and 79, and their Gen Z children, 96 to roughly 2010. There is no revolution, Tyler. This is the first thing we have to look at. They are listening to the same music. They're wearing the same clothes. Moms and daughters are making the TikTok videos together. They're sending them to each other and laughing. There is no revolution. In fact, you often ask teenage girls in focus groups who their best friend is. Number one most cited answer you'll get is mom. Now, it's maybe in our generation, but it's certainly if you go older than us. When I ask 50 to 60-year-olds if they would have said their mother was their best friend when they were in, 15 years old, what would happen to them? And they're, everybody's like, I would have gotten beat up, I would have got laughed at, like you would never say that. So there's this shift of parents are now seen as peers, friends, make decisions together. We're on a totally different level of communication. So what that means is when they come into our organizations, part of the shift is even in the way they see authority figures, the way they see leaders. They don't see hierarchy. They see a flattened network where we're peers. And so they can roll into the CEO's office and be like, yo, I got so many ideas for how we can totally revolutionize this place. Like, let me get you into the 21st century. And the CEO is thinking, you've been here like 5 days. Do you even know where the restroom is, let alone trying to help us redo our strategy? And it's beautiful that they think that, and we want to encourage it. But, we have to adjust as leaders. The other things that show up, and you sort of alluded to it, coming, graduating through or in COVID, many of them, when they were in elementary school, lived through the Great Recession, saw older siblings, right? So you couple the front end, they get that, on the back end, they get COVID, and they're survivors. And so I think you get these characteristics of highly resilient, highly resourceful, all of these tools at their disposal, never before a bigger message of like, you can figure it out, you can launch a side hustle. There's lots of ways other than the alternative path. But at the same time, they're dealing with a world where, the cost of living is 10x what it was before. And the thought of, am I ever going to be able to pay off my student loans or be able to afford a home? I don't know. Will I do better than my parents? For the first time, you've got a generation that's in question. And yet they still are showing up wanting to make a positive impact on the world. And I think that's incredibly noble and one of the most exciting things about them as a generation. So for us as leaders, it's just a matter of, can we help them harness all of that youthful energy, the resourcefulness, the resilience that they have, and apply it towards a vision that we have for both the team or the organization and them in their lives.
As you mentioned that and the thoughts swirling, I believe the greatest way to harness that is allowing for contribution, facilitating contribution and taking ownership. And I think it's, again, you mentioned as you describe it, like my early corporate career working for Cargill, a company you're used to, and you know that, it was much a individual performance. That's how you got promoted. You got into this space of leadership. Well, you did the same. And it's like, if I could take advantage of the guy that's younger than me so I can get the promotion, well, that's just the way it goes. And now we're in this phase of like, no, it's not like that. I'm a product of transformation there. You're a product of seeing that and a transformation. Say it needs to be different. And now we see the two divergent industry, leadership styles. The one I'm still trying to hold on to the past. Get your butt into the office, do that, and just sit and wait until it's your time. And then you have the ones that are like, well, I know that doesn't work because it didn't work for me. And so how do I harness this organization? And when I talk to those two divergent camps, and it's
Yeah.
not necessarily by age, there are
Yep.
people younger than us that want to hold on to get your butt in the office. That's the only way you can work. And there's people that are older us that are willing to just say, hey, let's contribute. Let's make sure we empower. Let's make sure we're all in this together. And if I can help you see more and before,
Yeah.
and you're in a contribution space, it's going to help me as a leader as long as I listen and discern. Where I see the challenge is when we face what you mentioned, people that have been either broken or poisoned by unsafe, unhealthy, controlling leadership. And to
Yep.
me, that is the biggest plight and pain point I see in our world. I see my kids that are in youth sports and they're performing for broken, insecure leaders, meaning leaders that there is not psychological safety. I've sat there on the sideline, I've seen it. I've seen or I've heard from the coach that's kind of like, no, you're not allowed to call an audible, even though that may be the right thing. Just do what you're told. And it's like, that isn't going to work because quite honestly, we're in a generation two
Yeah.
where some kids have learned more and seen more in regard to the actual industry than the people that are leading them because of the tools and technology that are boiled down in those experiences. And so it's kind of like, man, how do we collaborate? Because that's the solution instead of how do I command and control?
1,000%. That is the shift and the opportunity for us as leaders today. Can I transform? Can I transition from command and control, which comes natural? I mean, it's a part of our DNA to like operate in those structures.
Yeah.
And to move into a sense and empower type environment. And it's a two-way street. You know, you've got to be able to give responsibility, give autonomy, give authority, but we also, you need to see your people step up to those opportunities. You need to see people, be willing to be held accountable, to deliver in the moment. And, every time you do, it's like you earn a little bit more credibility, you earn a little bit more reputation. So it's like keep making the deposits. Yeah.
Well, to me, I mentioned this earlier. The way for that to the second key, you call it, sense and empower, and I very much align with that. And it's for that to work, it takes a tremendous amount of security, personal security, because you have to build in psychological safety. And at the same point, it has to come from a point of empowerment and not, I'm checked out, do whatever you want. Because that doesn't work either. Because what I find there is when either leaders check out, soon no one cares. But when they care and they hold accountability and they're willing to stand with accountability themselves and be held accountable, have that vulnerable authenticity, man, people have tremendous amount of grace and they are bought in. That buy-in, to me, as we're sitting here and, my tongue's tied up this morning. It's a little early. Right?
I do the same thing with that
Philosophizing.
word, philosophizing.
Yes.
Yeah.
About it, it's like, well, that's the way. It really is, saying I'm just a part of the group, but I'm going to make sure that we stay where our vision is. And I'm going to make sure we go there and not get sidetracked. But man, we have to move as an entire group together. And it can't be I raise
Tyler,
ahead and follow up. Go
Part
ahead.
of the challenges is that people get into positions of authority because they like to be in charge, because they like all of the trappings that come with it. But the reality is, you can't be a leader unless you love people. Period. Full stop. Like if you're in a position of leadership and you don't love people, some of you might not even really like people. It doesn't work in our environment anymore. We're being called to a heart-centered, human-centered, heart-led, freedom-infused environment for leadership. And so can I get myself to a place of loving my people? So what does that mean? That means what? That means pouring into my people. That means I grow my people so my people can grow the business. Okay? That's my goal. I want to see my people be successful. The more successful they are, the more successful I am. But I need to think of myself as I'm not putting the score on the board. My people are. My job is to coach and encourage and support and clear obstacles and put them in a position to be at their very best. If they win, I win. That means to love your people.
Well, what's amazing about that, and I agree wholeheartedly, is where the challenge comes that it's like, ooh, but that challenged my ego. Oh, because there's figures that still will look at the scoreboard. Okay, we won. Our team is winning. We are growing and developing. But it's like, oh, did I get any credit for that? Oh, because I want the credit so bad. And I'm afraid if I'm not getting the credit, then I won't get to keep my job, and they'll find somebody else, or somebody junior to me on the team is going to rise up and take my spot. There's that still that perpetuates even those people that understand loving. And to me, that is a numbered day to death. If you continue to hold on, there will be some point in time where you cut your own throat, where you hang yourself, where you do something where you're out because your desire to be known and recognized is greater than that of the team. And that still perpetuates, that's still there, even when you have people like Jim Collins, who easily and gratefully identified the leader who doesn't worry about that creates all the significance and impact in the world.
Sometimes that happens too, like as I think about like who's tuning in and listening depending upon where they sit in the organization. Sometimes that gets perpetuated because of cultural barriers, and sometimes it's structural barriers. And I'll give you some context.
Yeah.
Cultural barriers is like we don't reward the behaviors we want to see. So if we start highlighting and celebrating the leaders who lift their people up, the leaders who celebrate their people are the leaders who get celebrated, not the leaders who claim to have delivered, right? That's a cultural thing. Structural is sometimes incentive plans. We literally incentivize the behavior that we don't want. And so it might take a structural tweak. Again, I'm thinking about depending upon where a leader who's tuned in right now is listening, where maybe you have the discretion and the ability to guide a larger organization. You've got leaders working for you, and you're like, how do I change my leader's behavior? Well, what is the block? Is it a cultural barrier or is it a structural barrier? And sometimes it's both, but most of the time, Tyler, I see it's cultural. And so what do you, again, going back to, who are the leaders that get celebrated in your culture? Are they demonstrating the kind of leadership competencies, skills, demeanor that we want? That help our people perform the best? And if it doesn't, what would it look like if we changed it?
Well, and I think that comes back to the area that I want to spotlight is those ones that are willing to hold themselves accountable, and in that hold others accountable too. Because it isn't necessarily pointing fingers, but it's like, I messed up and we collectively, let's get better together. I mean, those are the leaders that help move people. And it's me coming back and understanding, hey, like you said, having a growth environment, having a growth culture. Well, that means the leader, you have to be modeling it. What are you doing to grow every day? What are you doing to make sure, what are you making sure that you put that forward first? Hey, and I think it's funny that, again, it's not funny because it happens. It's funny because of the irony. Hey, this is a growth-focused organization. We're about growth. Well, how much are you growing? I don't have time to grow. I'm not in a place to grow. Well, then you haven't not created that culture. Well, you may talk about it. You may lead team sessions. But if you're not modeling it and or recognizing this is where I need to grow, it's all just speak. It's all just mouthing the words, lip syncing, because no one's going to follow. And this ties back into something I see more over now than ever. The generation that's coming to work, the generation of my oldest, of my kids in general, they are very, very attuned into what's fake. Very attuned. Like, even to the point of like, it's fake. I have no tolerance for it. I'd rather be real, because they've been in the culture of everything is, the unfiltered Snapchats or some of those things that it's just like, oh, be who you are. And that's in some ways embraced. And they're like, dude, that's like, it's too much. It's too produced. Don't be so fake. It's quite honestly, this podcast, I don't edit my intro, my outro, this. Why? Because I want to be real. And I feel like if I were, it comes a little too polished. I believe that from stage. That's my style. I want to be more real. And
Yep.
knowing that there's also a generation that's like, thank God you're real.
Totally. Totally.
Because
Yep,
if we're not
it's the
real, what are we?
It's the new expectation.
Expound on that. I agree, but I want you to
Yeah, I mean,
go into it where you've seen that.
I mean, I think not only for younger generations, but for all of us, now that we're 15 years deep on social media, and the constant onslaught of being pitched, and they're always feeling like there's an alternative motive versus just showing up out of a place of pure, genuine service. Your real you in a place of authentically trying to add value to somebody's life. Like, we're just inundated with so much more crap today. And so there's a higher expectation. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think a word like authenticity oftentimes gets overused. It loses its meaning because people just hear, oh, you got to be authentic, got to be authentic. But like, if you really sit down with a leader and be like, what does that actually mean for you? How would you show up differently if you dropped into, more authentically being yourself? Or interrogating your communication and things that you're putting out. I mean, I'm constantly doing that too, of like the content that I'm putting out. Like, am I willing to drop into my real voice? Am I willing to put out a less polished version of it? And usually the reason why we don't, and this is true for all of us, regardless of our generations, is there's self-worthiness involved. Like, am I enough? If I just put me out there, is it enough?
Yes.
And for anybody who's listening and thinking about that in their own leadership practice of like, if I just showed up as me, is that enough? It's more than enough. You are enough. That's what we need from you. That's what we need from all of us.
I'm looking at the clock. I'm looking at our time together. But you just mentioned something that I think deserves digging into. And it's this authenticity. And this has been one of my things that I've people have said, oh, I want to be authentic. I want to be who I am. And whatever harshness that may be. And it's like, to me, that's toxic authenticity. If you think, oh, I can justify being this because of who I am, my belief there is if you're, authentic, then you're not hurting people and you're aware of that. If I carry myself or my language or my demeanor, my aggressiveness hurts people, then I'm wrong. But if my authenticity of like, hey, this has been my experience, this is what I am,
We need
but I'm cognizant.
Healed authenticity, aware
Absolutely.
authenticity, right?
Absolutely. Genuine authenticity. And authenticity means I want to be me so that way I can care and serve for those around me the absolute best way I can. And that may means that I have to check myself or my ego or my desires or whatever, because authentically, if that's hurting other people, then it's not serving them.
Yeah,
and if
100%.
my job through authenticity is to serve people, then I need to do whatever to build that safety to bring out the best, because that's what I'm here to do.
The marketplace is rewarding that today. The marketplace, workplaces, that's the price of entry.
Yeah, love that. Seth, this has been great. Thank you so much. I kind of knew it would be, because I love your content. I love what you're about, and can relate to so much of this journey you've gone through. Thank you for putting out what you do.
I appreciate it, brother. Thank you for the opportunity to share this space and have these conversations. We're grateful for you and the fact that you're doing this. And all of the things that we're talking about, watching you from afar, you are an example of these things. You are an example of a heart-led, authentic, vulnerable, generous leader showing up and giving from a place of abundance. And so I think more than any of the content and the guests that you have on, thank you for just being you and showing us what it looks like.
Man, thank you. Appreciate it, Seth.